I'm preaching to you from Esther chapter 4 today, and I know if you're thinking that might raise a couple questions, and one of them might be, it seems a bit random. Esther chapter 4, where does that come from? Well, there's two reasons for me preaching to you from Esther chapter 4 today. First of all, several months ago, or maybe it's even a couple of years ago, I don't know how long it's back, I was asked to preach at Storm Lake, and they assigned me Esther chapter 4 as their text. They said, we want you to preach from Esther chapter 4. And so I did. And then Sandy and I were down in Branson here by 6 weeks ago or so, and we went to the Sight and Sounds Theater, and guess what's playing at the Sight and Sounds Theater? The story of Esther, of course. So I thought, well, hey, let's just talk about it here at the Arthur Church this morning. So that's how I landed on Esther chapter 4 for you today. If you're wondering where that text came from or why I decided to preach on that, I'll trust that God's in it. I think it's pertinent to our day as well. But so I'm going to read it to you. That is chapter 4. And just invite you to join with me as we look at that chapter and consider it. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, and we know that at that point they had issued a decree that all the Jews should be destroyed, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict had been ordered to the king came, they greatly mourned among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was greatly distressed. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they should be put to death unless the king extends a gold scepter to them and spares their life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And my attendants and I will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out Esther's instructions. Well, we're going to zero in on this chapter in a minute, but before I do, I just want to ask a question. And it's about the whole book of Esther, really. And that question is, who is not mentioned, but also not missing in Esther? And if you know the story of Esther, you've read that, you know the answer to that question is God himself. There's no mention of God in the book of Esther. He isn't brought up in the course of actual conversation, or the words of the text doesn't mention or talk about God there. But when we look at the story of Esther and consider it, it's obvious to us that God is incredibly involved in this story. You can't read the story, you can't go through the story and realize that this all turned out the way it turned out because God was involved. Now just consider with me for a minute a few what ifs, just for the sake of argument here today. What if, in this story, Vashti had decided to go before the king? And when he called for her after that 180-day party and said, come to us and present your beauty to us, what if she'd went? There'd be no story. What if Esther had come in second in the queen contest? What if she came in second? What if the king was in no mood to see Esther when she walked into that room? And he wasn't about to have her one-up him by showing up without being invited. What if he hadn't held out the scepter to Esther? Some secondary what-ifs in this story is what if Mordecai was not the guy that discovered the plot to kill the king? Somebody else discovered it. And what if the king had had a really good night's sleep the night before the dinner with Esther and Haman, and he wasn't awake wondering about, what's going on here? I can't sleep tonight. And I ask you all those what ifs because when you think about all that, you know that God was in all that. God was in all that. Everything that happened has his hand on it. He was orchestrating this story. He was directing it to its conclusion. He was taking it where he wanted to go. And really today, that's my message to you, my reminder to you. You know this already, I know that. Proverbs 16:9 is a summary of what I want to say to you today. In his heart, man plans his course, but the Lord directs his steps. The truth of that statement is all over the story of Esther. In his heart, man plans his course, but the Lord orders his steps. And if we think about this story, we think about the king, Vashti, Mordecai, Esther, Haman, the whole works. That truth rests over that story. So I just want to walk through the text that we read today and think about that text together. What's the issue facing the Jews? Now, I mentioned it in the reading a little bit, but if we go back to chapter 3, we discover the issue that was facing the Jews, the actual issue. And in chapter 3, we discover that Haman is upset because Mordecai won't bow down to him. Remember how Haman was given the second place in the kingdom. The king gave him second place, and he said to all the people, when you see Haman walking by, you guys need to, bend the knee, bow your head, recognize his place of authority. And Mordecai didn't do it. And people were seeing this, and they were talking to Mordecai and saying, Mordecai, you need to bend the knee and bow the head. And Mordecai said, I ain't going to do that. And in the course of all that, he revealed to the people the reason he wasn't going to do that, because he worshiped one God. He bowed his head to one God, and he didn't bow his head to anybody else. And word gets to Haman that this Mordecai guy is not bowing to him. Now, he may not have seen him right away because everybody was bowing, and maybe Mordecai was in the background and they didn't notice it. But when it was pointed out to him that Mordecai was not bowing his head, he looked for it. And the next time Haman went out and went through the city, he watched Haman, and Haman didn't bow his head to Mordecai. And the issue in front of us has a lot of parts, and I just want to go over it real quickly with you. First of all, it was Haman's ego. Haman had all these people bowing, one wasn't, and the only thing that mattered was the one that wasn't. His ego was involved. I'm not getting the credit I deserve. Haman was also a man of power. He had authority. He could do something about it. He had the authority to do something about it. And his heart was set on vengeance. Whenever a heart's set on vengeance, it's a heart that's in trouble. And Haman's heart was set on vengeance. And his conclusion was, I'm not only going to kill Haman, I'm going to kill every Jew in the kingdom. I'll show those people. Now, I would suggest to you that at this point in the story, Proverbs 19:6 is not so obvious, but it's there. It is there. God directs the steps. If you were asking a Jewish people about the conditions of their world at that time, how do you suppose they might answer? They might have responded, well, it's a bit crazy. It's upside down. It's out of control. Now, I don't know about you, but have you ever heard anybody describe our world that way? A bit crazy? Upside down? Out of control? We would describe our own world that way, wouldn't we? In so many ways. But I want you to know that in the story of Esther, God was not idle. And in our story today, God is not idle either. We don't see it maybe. We can't identify it. But his hand is on it. Men plan their course. God directs their steps. So we read in chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, that the people, once they heard this edict, they were in sackcloth and ashes. And they were wailing before God. They were crying out to God. And I would assume in their wailing and crying out to God, they were also praying to God along the way. And as I read that and think about that, my mind went to 1 Peter 5, 6, and 7. You might know that by heart, perhaps. Humble yourself, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxieties upon him, because he cares for you. And I would suggest to you that the church, and when I say the church, I say capital C. I'm not talking about Arthur alone. I'm saying the church, big C, capital C, might take a page from Esther and 1 Peter in times like this, the times we live in, and humble ourselves before God. And maybe we should even consider praying and fasting along the way. We'll talk about prayer a little more later on. But in this situation, that's where the people were. They were in pretty desperate position. So Mordecai comes to Esther, and he challenges Esther. He says, you could do something about this. You could do something about this. And he challenges her to take action. He calls for her to abandon her comfort and to be courageous. Now, if you read the text, when I read it, I don't know if you noticed this, but Esther doesn't know anything about what's going on out there in the world, beyond her walls. The only reason she knows that Haman is upset, he's wearing sackcloth, and all this fuss is going on, is because the people who care for her, they go home every day. They go to their house every day, and they come back to the palace and take care of the queen the next morning. And when they're going back and forth, they see these Jews all upset, and they see Haman in sackcloth and ashes. And Esther doesn't have a clue that he's in sackcloth and ashes, because she's living in this wonderful bubble called the queen's life. And she has no idea what's going on. But they go to her and say, do you know what's happening to Haman? Do you know what he's doing? And they say, you know what he's doing? He's out there in sackcloth and ashes, and he's crying out and wailing and bemoaning things. And she's completely oblivious to this in her world. She is living a life of comfort. You know, there was one word that Esther never heard when she asked for something. You know what it was? No. She never heard no. If she wanted something, she got it. If she asked for something, they brought it. She never heard someone say, I'm sorry, but we can't give that to you. We can't provide that for you. If she wanted it, she was living a life of absolute comfort. Her job was to be pretty, and apparently it wasn't hard. She won the contest for being pretty. That's what she did. Just be pretty. And Mordecai calls her and says, I want you to leave your comfort, your little bubble, and I want you to be courageous. And I want you to know that's quite a request, really. And Mordecai says to Esther, he says, listen, Esther, I want you to go to the king, and I want you to beg him for mercy on behalf of your people. And he was saying to her, I want you to go there, and I want you to identify yourself as being with us, a Jewish lady, and I want you to respond. And go and beg for the people. Now, Esther sends back a response, and verses 9 through 11, and her response, if in a word, was, that's easier said than done. Going to the king and begging for mercy, that's not an easy thing to do. And she points out to Mordecai that there's the people who go to the king unannounced, there's only one law. There aren't two laws, there's one law. And the law was, if you walk in on the king and he hasn't asked for you to be there, you're dead. That's it. No questions asked. He doesn't want anybody showing up that's not supposed to be there. And the rule was they would die. And so Esther says, Mordecai, that's the rule. You know that, don't you? And then she says, by the way, I haven't been asked to go before the king for 30 days. It's been a while. I don't know when I'm going to go back. And I would suggest to you, if I might here, that Esther's torn between courage and comfort at this point a little bit. That would be good if to do something like that, but I don't see any real avenue of getting that done and staying in the framework of my bubble, my place. I might be harsh on Esther here. You forgive me if I am, but I would like to suggest that maybe what she was saying is this: I'd love to help, but it's not convenient. It's not convenient. I'd love to do something for you. I'd love to provide for you, but it's not convenient. Do we ever find ourselves there where somebody's asking us to do something that's not convenient? I'd love to help, but it's not convenient. And if it's not convenient, is that a good enough reason not to do it? Because if I did it, it'd make me uncomfortable. If I did it, it would push me to my limits. That can be our issue sometimes, can't it? It was maybe for Esther here. I'd love to help, but it's not convenient. So Mordecai sends her back a second message. And he says to her, do not think because you are in the king's house that you alone of all the Jews will escape. He said, don't think that your place is all that secure. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Mordecai is confident that God's going to deliver. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows? But you have come to this very royal position for such a time as this. God orders our steps. Mordecai says, maybe the reason you were chosen for queen was for this very hour. So he makes 2 points to Esther. First point is, you may be comfortable, but it's not guaranteed. You may be comfortable now, but if you think, well, I'll just protect my comfort, there's no guarantee you'll have it going forward. And sometimes we like to protect our comfort at the expense of doing the right thing. Point number 2, maybe you've come to this place for such a time as this. Maybe this is why you're there. God has directed your steps. He has put you in this position. He's given you that privilege for this very moment. It calls for courage and it calls for action. And believe me, it was not an easy action. In his heart, a man plans his course, but the Lord directs his steps. And Mordecai was saying to Esther, the Lord put you here, Esther, for the very moment that you're in. So Esther responds. And she responds, and I would give 2 words to her response. She responds to the challenge, and the 2 words I'd give you is prayer and perish. Prayer and perish. She says to Mordecai, okay, I will go. But I'll only go if you pray first. You've got to pray first. And not just a casual, before lunch prayer. I want you to spend 3 days praying and fasting, no food, no water. That's a long time without food or water. And Esther says, I'll do the same thing. You know, when Esther walks into the king, she's going to look pretty. I got to believe she was wearing her best, don't you think? You know, she wanted to, if you want to think in human terms, she walked into the king, she wanted a wow factor. I want this to be wow. But more important than what she wore on the outside of her body that day, she wanted to be covered in prayer walking into that room. That was what really mattered to her. She wanted to be covered in prayer. It wasn't the clothes that she wore that would woo the king's heart. It was the prayer of God's people. And God hearing that prayer and responding to that prayer that would move the king's heart to receive her. Now, I want to say this to you. I know you know this, but I want to remind you, earnest prayer matters. Earnest prayer matters. In James 5:16, it says the prayer of a righteous man, and I would add woman there just for the sake of our day, is powerful and effective. I know that to be true personally. I can think, as I stand here today, of one situation where I was asked to do something that was significantly beyond my ability to do. It just was. And we won't argue about that. It just was. It was way, the way I would put it is, it was above my pay grade. It was more than I could do. And I remember coming to God in earnestness and saying, Lord, I can't do that. It's just above I can't do that. And the Lord, in a significant way, said to me, yes, you can. I'll see to it. And you know what? He did and I did. I did it because he was in it. We have a young man he's not in our church at this moment, but we had a young man years ago that was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer. That's not a good diagnosis. And the church earnestly prayed for him. And God in his mercy, on that occasion, in that story, spared that young man's life. Today, he's still alive, some 10, 15 years later, and still doing well. And God did that. You as a church here at Arthur, if I gave you a chance to testify, and if you think about it, you have seen earnest prayer matter in your congregation. There have been times in your church's story where you guys got together and you earnestly prayed for a circumstance, a situation, a context, and you saw God do some significant, powerful things as a result of your gathering for prayer. And you can remember those things. You can identify those things. Those things, even as I speak, perhaps are floating in your mind. Say, yeah, I remember that. I remember when we did that. I remember how it turned out. And I would ask us to consider this question: what will bring change to our world? Now, we might answer that question with a lot of things, a lot of suggestions, but is prayer among them? Is prayer among them? Am I really convinced that if I earnestly pray, my world will change? It will change my world. And I would encourage us to put prayer on that list. If my world is going to change, one of the things that will change it is when God's people earnestly pray and seek God's face and ask him to move and to act in our world. Esther said to the guys, you pray, then I'll go. And folks, I would encourage us to pray and to be a praying people. Now, the second word I have is perish. In the moment she was living, she didn't know how it was going to end. Now, I got to tell you, I was at the Sight and Sound Theater 6-8 weeks ago. I did not worry for a minute what was going to happen. When Haman took power, no big deal. And the reason it was no big deal, because I knew how it was going to end. I knew the end of the story. But Esther didn't. Not here. Not in chapter 4. She didn't have any idea how it was going to end. There were a lot of options out there. And one of them wasn't very good. You know, when we read the Bible, it occurs to me that a lot of God's Bible stories are like that. For example, Joseph is a slave being hauled off to Egypt. You only have to read 4 more chapters to find him in the second only to Pharaoh. I mean, it's quick, right? You can read those chapters in 20 minutes. And it just happens. Yeah, it turned out great. But not in the moment for Joseph, it didn't. He had a lot of in the moments between the one chapter and the other. Moses, Job, Abraham. And you know, we live in our own moment. And in my moment, I don't know how it's going to end. I mean, the big picture, yes. I know how that's going to end. When I die and leave this world, I know where I'm going and I know what's going to be. But as far as 2024 and 2025 and 2026 and so on, I don't know. I don't know. But in Esther's moment, even though she did not know how it was going to end, she made a commitment. She said, look, if I perish, I perish. And I want you to know that was really possible. I don't really know how it worked there. I don't know if anybody ever tried to go to the king without being informed. With that law being what it was, and kings being who they are, I doubt if anybody ever pushed that envelope. I'm not going to do that. But I want you to also know, and I would just use, not every story ends, if I might use the word, in a happy ever after fashion. You know, if I look at Joseph and say, well, yeah, but look what happened to him in the end, and so on. And one of my key people I think about is John the Baptist. John the Baptist served God, loved God, preached. You know, he prepared the way for Jesus. And how does he die? At the hands of a jealous, evil, wicked woman who says, I want his head on a platter. It didn't end well, if I might say it that way, physically, humanly, for John the Baptist. And it doesn't always. I can't sit up here and say, well, if you do that, it's always going to turn out happy ever after. What if she had perished? What if Esther had walked into that room, the king saw her and thought, oh, here's another queen trying to pull a fast one on me. I know what Vashti did, and I had to deal with her. I didn't kill her, but I had to deal with her, and now she's trying to one-up me. I'm not going to have that happen. And you know, what if that would have been his attitude? Consider this. I think this was written by J.I. Packer. I believe it's written. He writes these words. He says, Lord, it belongs not to my care whether I live or die. If I live and serve you is my share. This your grace must give. Let me say that again. If I live and serve you is my share. This your grace must give. If life be long, I shall be glad that I may long obey. But if short, then why should I be sad to soar to endless day? If life be short, I got heaven coming forever. Esther didn't know what the king was going to do when she walked into that room. And Esther went into that room covered in prayer. And you know, well, we know the rest of the story, right? But we're in our own moment right now, you and I. And we don't know the rest of that story. It's still to be lived, still to be laid out, still to happen. But in the course of doing that, can I trust and obey God as I travel that journey that's unknown to me? We are in our moment. We don't know how it's going to end. But we must answer the question, even as Esther answered that question. Lord, will I follow you? Will I obey you? Will I abandon my desire for comfort and live courageously for you? along the way. Man plans his course, but God directs his steps. And he does that for each of us. He does that for you, and he does that for me. Let's pray together. Lord God of heaven, I just thank you for this story in Esther, in this chapter we've looked at today. Thank you for her courage. She had an awful lot of comfort she gave up to do a very courageous thing. But in the course of it all, Lord, you were there, and you provided for her, and you helped her accomplish her task and her mission. Perhaps she was there, and I'm sure she was, for such a time as this. Help us, Father, as we are in our moment today, to be committed to loving you, following you, obeying you, and serving you in ways that you call us to, even when they're not comfortable. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.